here, you can see the job view of an account. So here I didn't prepare a data set with more than 100, but it's like 50 jobs that we have in here, and it's absolutely chaos, as you can see. So like if we would go to the overall KPIs, then you can see currently we have got 21 delayed jobs. So that's 40% delays, and that's awful. And now you can come to the conclusion, okay, then I'm going to move around these jobs manually, make use of the critical sequence number bus, but come on, this is what time consuming is, right? So, and therefore we now provide functionality that helps you to reprioritize efficiently. So therefore, what we do is we go into the settings tab and go into the settings dialog. And here we have got the tab job sequence number calculation. And this is currently empty, as so far I did not make use of this automated functionality at all. But if I would like to do so, I need to add a criteria that is taken for calculating the job sequence numbers accordingly. So, and to add this criteria, just add a line. By the way, you can add multiple criteria. So the first criteria will be checked, and if two jobs would show up with the same criteria result, then they go into the second iteration for the second criteria. So here, what kind of criteria we have, the due date, and so on and so on. So let's start off with the due date, because why that? Because like the due date is maybe or was the most requested criteria for such an automated calculation. So when you guys reached out to us before we had that functionality, the due date was the most requested criteria. And now let's do that. So now the job priorities will be calculated based on the due date in that way that the nearer in time the due date, the higher the priority of the job. Okay, so let's first add the criteria. And this is now added, but not yet calculated accordingly. To trigger a resequencing, you need to go to the update section, and by having the criteria added, you know, we have activated this icon here in the schedule section of updating. And if I now trigger the recalculation by clicking, then it will be rescheduled accordingly. Let's do that. And now you can see different picture here, right? So like we can directly see within the KPIs that before it was 21 jobs delayed, now it's 13. So just by taking the due date as the criteria to recalculate the priority of the jobs, we could make it way better. So now from 40% delays, it is now 25%. Actually, good move, right? And it was quick, way quicker than doing all this manually separately, job by job. But to be honest, guys, the due date in my eyes is not a criteria that I recommend you to choose. Why is that? Because like, let's look at some jobs. So like here, a job has a due date that is pretty near. But what we also need to have considered is how much capacity is actually requested from the earliest possible point of time until the due date. So it's not all about the time distance, right? It is also to be considered how much productive capacity is requested by that job within that remaining time frame to the due date, right? And therefore, what I recommend to take instead of the due date is following. So let's go back in there. And this is the max buffer. So the max buffer is exactly what I explained to you. It takes a due date also, but from the due date, it deducts the total amount of time of unscheduled capacity needed to come there. So actually we call this total amount of capacity MRCT, maximum required cycle time. This is deducted and the residual of time is taken to prioritize jobs. And we have done lots of simulations before releasing this functionality. And in the end, in the vast majorities of use cases that we just took into consideration, the max buffer was showing up with the best results. So now let's take the max buffer. First of all, get it into the system, not scheduled yet, but what we need to do is again have a recalculation based now on max buffer. And see here from the due date, we can improve because now it is not 13 jobs delayed, but only 10. So it was not an as big improvement, but obviously the max buffer is showing better results than taking the due date as the basis to automatically calculate job priorities. So from here, looking down into the schedule, looks way better than the chaos up front. But now let's try to get an understanding why we have the delays. So let's try to identify the bottleneck. Therefore, we switch over to the resource-centric view. So looking into the resource-centric view, it is all about, identifying like a damming up phenomenon. And to also furthermore, to help you spot bottlenecks, we have got a dedicated color scheme, which is the waiting times color scheme. Now I apply this color scheme. And with that color scheme, all operations that do have a waiting time are colored in blue. So waiting time means that they are not starting at the earliest possible start date, but they do need to wait for other operations of more important jobs before they can be scheduled. So that's the definition of waiting time. And you have got some orange. This is those operations that have waiting time and belong to delayed jobs. So now if you just scroll down and see where we have the waiting times and where we have got the damming up phenomenon is very easy to spot here. So it's obviously the cutting section, and also we directly can see a reason. So like formerly there used to be two laser cutting machines, and obviously one is taken out of operations right now, and the entire order backlog needs to run through laser one. And this is causing delays, obviously. So now, if it comes to OTD, the best approach is just finding any alternative way of handling the laser cutting. So if you would have even the oldest laser cutting facility somewhere internally where it is very costly, so like and high efforts would come along with getting it going, so the setup cost would be high, even, and it would be way slow, so maybe just 2 times slower as the normal modern laser cutting machine. Here it will be an option, because what happens is if you reduce the load of the bottleneck, then the entire queue here will benefit from it. So pretty much every additional minute in the bottleneck will affect all jobs that run through that bottleneck. So, and also if you would just have the opportunity to outsource somewhere, also take this into consideration, not for each and every operation, but for selected ones. So just to give you an example of the impact. So we just go now here and we outsource, and take out this workload out of the bottleneck, and then let us see what happens. So therefore, I am just assigning it from the machine to outsourcing. And as I outsource, I would not need internal manpower. So I delete this, and then let's see what happens. So here directly you can see that the entire queue, is pushed to the left, and with pushing that bottleneck to the left, all the rest is pushed to the left as much as possible. And here you can see, outsourcing one operation has a significant impact. From 10 delays, it is just a remaining amount of 3 delays. So that was like a huge step, even though the amount of outsourced workload is pretty low, I'm sorry. Okay, so for that reason, I highly recommend always to check what really limits your throughput within your shop floor operations. And once you've spotted it, try to think about alternatives of adding additional capacity, either by getting some additional internal facilities running, even if they have higher costs. And second, of course, always, if you have got possibilities to outsource or to think about, but do not outsource too much. Just select those operations within the time windows where you have the bottlenecks and reduce the load there. Okay, so now going back to the job view, looks different compared to what we had initially, right? So like it is just a few jobs delayed. So now once could come to the conclusion, okay, from here on, maybe I give it a try and, try to calculate critical sequence numbers and to do some fine tuning. Maybe I can bring it down to 2 or even 1 delays. So yes, you can do. But what you also can do is think of which job to take first doing that exercise. And what I recommend is, if you know that you have got some jobs within your order backlog that do not need to run through the bottleneck that you just have spotted, start with these jobs. I call them the non-bottleneck jobs. So here we know that laser cutting still is the bottleneck. And I know that I have a job routing in my system here that doesn't need the laser cutting, and that is my routing number 5. So here, all jobs that were created based on routing number 5, or maybe are still connected to routing number 5, do not run through the bottleneck. So it is a total different category of jobs. These jobs do not compete with the other ones. So they really can take care of any idle times, but they are not fighting against the bottleneck. And therefore, let's spot jobs that belong to job routing 5 or have been created based on it. So what I do, I just spot those jobs created from job template number 5. And here it's 2 jobs. And just for reasons of pragmatism, I gave them a suffix R5. So we can see these R5 jobs, these do not run through the bottleneck. Okay, let's start with these jobs and schedule them individually. And here I recommend to make use of the critical sequence number. Let's start out with the first one. Here we can see that you even can go down to the lowest priority, without any delays. That is not very surprising, actually. So like what happens is exactly what I explained. You can give it a lower priority, and nothing happens because like it is just not fighting against the same bottleneck. But unfortunately, with bringing it down here, it freed up some resources, but these resources could not be used by any other job that is now higher prioritized. So let's do the same exercise with the other one, other non-bottleneck jobs. So we calculate and now see what happens here. So like if I give it the critical sequence number of 31, then it frees up resources for other jobs that needs to run through the bottleneck. And with freeing up these resources, I even get a conflict-free plan. Doing this, whoops, none. Remember where we came from? It was a chaotic plan. And with just, adding the criteria max buffer, having one scheduling or automated calculation of priorities, we could bring it down. Then we spotted the bottleneck. We decided to make just one minor outsourcing step. And last but not least, we spotted the non-bottlenecks jobs to make use of them to make some very little individual scheduling efforts. And here we are, a conflict-free plan. So what I recommend actually is making use of the automated calculation functionality for those jobs that are not super important. So that jobs that are super important. And by the way, also this is true for jobs that have been started. I recommend that you exclude them from the calculation by pinning. Also the super important jobs pin. By experience here, I've seen that is pretty much the 20-80 rule, as I call it. So like 20% you should pin because this is absolutely manageable and all power should be in your hand, if it comes to scheduling those very important jobs. But all the volatile rest, you can leave with a max buffer. This is really saving time and it's powerful. Still, you have got some extra options for individual scheduling, but don't do that in a blind way. So like think about sort of separate between bottlenecks and non-bottlenecks jobs. So like, gain some insights. You get the visibility by making use of our, powerful functionality and the visible approach here. And this insights, use it, to schedule. Do not do these interactions fully blind. That makes no sense.